They learned early that asking for help was pointless, so they stopped asking. They figured it out alone. And now, decades later, they're still carrying that weight, wondering why connection feels so hard, why rest feels like failure, why they can't seem to need anyone. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, this might be your story, and there's actual psychology behind why you are the way you are. Generation X, the forgotten middle child of generations, sandwiched between the boomers who had their moment and the millennials who won't stop talking about theirs. They grew up during a time when the world was shifting in ways no one wanted to admit. Divorce rates skyrocketed. Both parents worked if they stayed together at all. The house was empty after school. The key hung around their neck and they let themselves in. Latchkey kids, they called them. But what they really were children learning a very specific lesson. No one is coming. You have to handle this yourself. This wasn't abuse in the traditional sense, it was absence. And absence teaches just as powerfully as presence. The nervous system of a child doesn't distinguish between intentional neglect and circumstantial abandonment. It just registers, I am alone, I must adapt. And adapt they did. They became resourceful, independent, tough. But beneath that toughness, something else was forming. A belief system, a wiring. The brain was learning that needing someone was dangerous, that asking was pointless, that the only person you could rely on was yourself. In psychology, this is called avoidant attachment. It's not a personality flaw, it's a survival strategy. When caregivers are inconsistent or unavailable, a child's brain makes a decision. Connection is unreliable, so I'll stop seeking it. I'll take care of myself. And for a child growing up in the chaos of the 70s and 80s, that decision made perfect sense. It kept them safe, it kept them functional. But what keeps a child safe at 8 can leave an adult isolated at 48. And so they grew up. They became adults who pride themselves on figuring it out alone. They don't ask for directions. They don't ask for help. They don't ask for much of anything really. Because somewhere deep in their wiring, asking feels like weakness. It feels like failure. And failure, to someone who had to raise themselves, is unacceptable. So they push harder, they work longer, they carry more. And they do it all with a straight face, insisting they're fine. But here's what that costs. Hyper-independence looks like strength, but it's often just fear in a different outfit. It's the nervous system saying, I can't rely on anyone, so I won't try. And that belief doesn't just affect how they handle stress. It affects how they love, how they parent, how they show up in relationships. Vulnerability feels like standing on the edge of a cliff. Asking for support feels like handing someone a loaded gun. So they don't. They'd rather struggle in silence than risk being let down again. Inside, the dialogue runs like this. If I just work harder, I won't need anyone. If I'm useful enough, I won't be a burden. If I keep it together, no one will see how much I'm actually struggling. And the tragic part is, they've been keeping it together for so long that even they don't realize how heavy it's gotten. The weight of decades of self-reliance, the exhaustion of never leaning, the loneliness of being surrounded by people but still feeling like you're on an island. But they're not broken, they're not cold. Their nervous system learned that connection was unreliable, so it built walls to keep them safe. That was smart. That was survival. But what kept them safe at 8 is now keeping them lonely at 48. And the work isn't about tearing those walls down overnight. It's about recognizing why they're there in the first place. Generation X didn't just learn to be independent, they learned to be cynical. And there's psychology behind that too. They grew up watching systems fail. Watergate taught them politicians lie. Corporate downsizing taught them loyalty is a one-way street. The economic crashes taught them that stability is an illusion. Even family structures were falling apart around them. So their brains adapted again. They developed what psychologists call a negative bias. The brain started scanning for threats instead of safety. It started expecting disappointment instead of hope. And that's not pessimism, that's pattern recognition. Cynicism isn't bitterness, it's hypervigilance dressed as realism. It's the brain saying, I've seen this before, and it didn't end well, so I'm not falling for it again. And in many ways, that served them well. They see through nonsense faster than most. They're hard to manipulate. They don't buy into movements just because they're trendy. They ask the hard questions. They demand proof. They're grounded in a way that's rare in a world obsessed with performance and optics. But there's a cost to that too. When you've seen too many things fall apart, it becomes hard to believe anything can actually work. When you've been let down enough times, hope starts to feel naive, dangerous even. So they stop hoping. They stop trying to change things. Not because they don't care, but because they've seen too many movements become marketing campaigns. Too many promises become lies. And somewhere along the way, they developed a low-level exhaustion that never quite goes away. Not depression, exactly, but a kind of emotional armor that's so heavy they've forgotten they're even wearing it. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. It's what happens when someone tries to change their circumstances over and over, only to fail. Eventually, the brain stops trying. It decides, nothing I do matters, so why bother? And while Generation X might not fit the textbook definition, there's a shade of it in how they navigate the world. A quiet resignation. A sense that things are what they are, and fighting it is pointless. Their skepticism kept them from being hurt again, but it might also be keeping them from feeling fully alive. And here's where it gets complicated. Because Generation X is surrounded by people, but many of them feel profoundly alone. They have families, jobs, responsibilities. But underneath all of that, there's an ache they don't talk about. Loneliness, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that lives in marriages that function but feel distant. In friendships that faded because life got busy, which was easier than admitting that vulnerability felt too risky. In the exhaustion of parenting alongside a partner but still feeling like you're doing it alone. Neuroscience tells us that loneliness activates the same brain regions as physical pain. It's not just an emotion, it's a signal, a warning that something essential is missing. But for someone who learned early that needing people is dangerous, that signal gets ignored, overridden, buried under layers of "I'm fine." And the worst part is, they don't even know how to ask someone to swim over to their island. Because asking was never an option. It was never safe. This is ambivalent attachment in action, the simultaneous desire for closeness and terror of it, the push and pull, the wanting to be seen and the fear of being known. It's not a choice. It's a nervous system response. And it plays out in 1,000 small ways, in the way they deflect compliments, in the way they change the subject when conversations get too deep, in the way they stay busy so they don't have to feel what's underneath. But here's the thing. The independence that saved them might now be the very thing keeping them from the life they actually want. And that's not an accusation. It's an invitation. An invitation to ask, what if healing isn't about fixing yourself? What if it's about updating the software? What worked at 10 doesn't serve you at 45? The walls that protected you then might be the walls that isolate you now. Healing doesn't mean becoming someone else. It doesn't mean turning into an extrovert or suddenly trusting everyone. It means recognizing that self-reliance and self-imprisonment aren't the same thing. You can be strong and still need people. You can be capable and still ask for help. There's a difference between independence and isolation, and somewhere along the way, the line got blurred. It also means understanding that cynicism and discernment aren't the same thing. You don't have to become naive to let hope back in. You don't have to ignore red flags to believe something good is possible. You can be wise and still open. You can protect yourself and still connect. But that requires something terrifying. Vulnerability, small doses, with safe people, Not a grand gesture, but a tiny experiment. Sharing one real thing, asking for one small bit of help, and then noticing what happens. Noticing that most people don't weaponize your honesty. Most people actually want to help. It makes them feel valued, needed, human. But it won't feel natural. The body will resist. The brain will scream danger. The old wiring will kick in and say, "This is a mistake, shut it down." And that's not failure. That's the nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. Protect you. Be patient with it. Be kind to it. It's been working overtime for decades. It doesn't know yet that the war is over. And here's the other shift that has to happen. Recognizing that peace and avoidance aren't the same thing. Staying small isn't healing. Keeping quiet isn't serenity. Sometimes what looks like peace is just exhaustion in disguise. Sometimes what feels like control is just fear with better PR. The question isn't whether you can keep holding it together. It's whether you want to spend the rest of your life proving you can. Because here's what Generation X has that no other generation quite does. Resilience without performance, depth without drama, loyalty without loudness, realness in a world that's drowning in filters and curated lives. They know how to survive hard things without pretending those things didn't happen. They know how to show up without needing applause. They know how to be steady in the chaos. And that matters. That's rare. That's a gift. But only if they let themselves be seen. Only if they stop equating need with failure. Only if they allow themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, things can be different. Because they're the bridge generation, the ones who can teach the younger ones that you don't have to be loud to matter, that you can care deeply without performing it, that you can survive without pretending you're invincible. But they can only teach that if they live it. If they stop treating connection like a risk and start treating isolation like one. They spent their whole lives proving they didn't need anyone. Maybe it's time to find out what happens when they let someone in anyway. Not because they're weak, not because they failed, but because they're human. And humans weren't designed to do this alone. So if this hit somewhere deep, if it felt like someone finally put words to something you've been carrying, leave a thought in the comments, especially if you're Gen X. What part of this landed hardest? And if you want more of this, more honest psychology, more of the stuff we don't talk about enough, subscribe. This channel is building something real, something that doesn't insult your intelligence or offer easy answers, just truth, just understanding. Just the quiet work of making sense of being human. And here's the question to sit with. The one that might change everything if you let it. What would change in your life if you stopped treating connection like a risk and started treating isolation like one? Sit with that. Feel it, and maybe, just maybe, try something different.